China is now a superpower that makes the United States and Europe tremble. We're discussing a country with major global industrial influence, advancing technologies, and prompting the West to reconsider how to protect its own industry. But while on one hand there's China destined to dominate the 21st century, on the other hand there's also the China of the real estate crisis, declining population, and an economy that's starting to falter. China is a powerhouse in sectors like electric cars, batteries, and solar panels. These are sectors that impact the energy transition, the industrial future, advanced economies, and the geopolitical competition among major powers. And China's strength lies mainly in its scale, because China can produce enormous quantities, thus lowering costs and capturing many markets. Just think that in 2025, the total value of Chinese imports and exports of goods reached about 40%, 5.5 trillion yuan, equal to about $6.8 trillion. With exports amounting to about 27 trillion yuan, which is about $4.05 trillion. And imports, on the other hand, amount to about 18.5 trillion yuan, which is about $2.77 trillion, and the trend is clear. China's share of global goods exports was about 4% in 2000, while today it has reached 16%. It's a country that accounts for 16% of global exports. It's a country that has the strength needed to influence the world economy. And this leverage is already visible, with Europe fearing it will lose its industry, the United States trying to block China's access to advanced chips, and Russia, after the invasion of Ukraine, depending more and more on Beijing to stay afloat. And China has become gigantic thanks to a growth model based on urbanization, investments, and loans. That is, a system in which millions of people moved from the countryside to the cities. The state built infrastructure, the real estate sector grew, factories produced for the world, and the middle class therefore increased its income. And for years this model created development, built cities, increased the value of houses, and gave families the feeling of becoming wealthier. But today something has broken. And the most obvious case is real estate, one of the pillars of the entire Chinese growth model. Because a home represents a family's savings, perceived wealth, and financial security. Meanwhile, for local governments, the land market was a fundamental source of public revenue, because they sold land use rights to developers. So the more the real estate sector grew, the more money came in to finance public spending and new infrastructure. Keep in mind that for years, real estate and infrastructure accounted for almost a third of the country's total demand. Meanwhile, Chinese families allocate almost 70% of their wealth to housing. However, this also means that if the real estate sector slows down, the problem won't just affect construction companies, but also families and the regional government, which will have less money to finance growth, and that's what's happening. In fact, the International Monetary Fund tells us that the contraction of the Chinese real estate sector is now in its fourth year and continues to slow down the Chinese economy. In practice, much less is being built and completed than before. And investments in housing have dropped from 12.3% of GDP in 2020 to 6.1% in 2025. The number of completed houses is almost 40% less compared to 2021, and there are many more unsold homes remaining on the market. And according to the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics, in 2025 investments in real estate development have dropped by 17.2%. Residential investments have dropped by 16.3%. The floor area of new building starts has decreased by 20.4%. And new commercial floor space sold has decreased by 8.7%. And the mechanism of the crisis of confidence means that if a family sees their house losing value, they feel less wealthy. And if they feel less wealthy, they will spend less. And if they spend less, companies will sell less. And if companies sell less, they will hire less. And as a result, if the job market weakens, young people start to postpone spending, marriage, having children, and life plans, creating a real vicious cycle. In addition, the housing problem is linked to debt. Because many administrations have financed growth and infrastructure through land sales, but also by taking on debt. So if the real estate market declines, it will require taking on even more debt. And that same debt will become harder to manage. And all of this also weighs on growth. In fact, the International Monetary Fund predicts that China's GDP growth will slow from 5 in 2025 to 4.5 in 2026, and that it will continue to accelerate in the medium term. But what is the real problem with China? The big internal imbalance in China is that the country produces a lot but consumes too little compared to its productive capacity. It means that its industrial machine is so large that it can't find enough space within the domestic market. And so a part of that production has to be exported to Europe, the United States, and emerging markets. In fact, the International Monetary Fund explains that in 2020, Chinese growth was supported by strong exports and public stimulus, while domestic demand was weak and inflation was at 0%. And be careful, inflation at zero may seem like good news, but in reality it signals that the economy is not moving much, and so prices aren't rising because there's little demand. Or worse, prices could even start to fall, leading to deflation, which is the opposite of inflation. The fact remains, however, that in the meantime, the World Bank adds that in the first quarter of 2026, China exported much more than it imported. So much so that this difference amounted to 3.8% of GDP. We're talking about the trade surplus. And a very large trade surplus is a sign of strength. It can also mean domestic demand is too weak, since if your market can't absorb production, you must export the surplus. And this is exactly where the concern arises, because China needs the world to absorb what its domestic economy can't absorb. The rest of the world is now defending itself against Chinese industrial pressure. Partly out of fear that imports from China will damage their own markets, and partly because China is also starting to become a geopolitical concern. And consider that in 2025, China recorded a record trade surplus of $1.2 trillion, while Chinese exports to the European Union grew by 16.4% between January and May, compared to the same period the previous year. And this for Europe is a warning sign, because it means that an increasingly large share of Chinese production is being dumped on the European market, sometimes even at the expense of European companies. That's why there's so much talk about European tariffs on China. In addition, today Chinese exports compete with almost 58% of the exports from Euro area countries compared to 46% in 2000. But the worst part is that the competition has shifted to sectors that matter strategically to the West. And it's no longer just about simple, low-value added goods, but also advanced industries, green technologies, and key components for European manufacturing. And this is where the issue of overcapacity comes in, because China has built too much industrial capacity in some sectors compared to domestic demand. So even China, it has a sort of dependence on the rest of the world. And for years, the West has benefited from low-cost Chinese production. By entering sectors Europe hoped would revive its industry, like green technology, China is also becoming a political problem for Brussels. This is the Chinese contradiction. The more it exports, the more it proves to be strong. But the more it proves to be strong, the more it forces others to close themselves off. And the more others close themselves off, the more fragile the model based on Chinese exports becomes. And all of this also affects the lives of ordinary people. Because when supply chains become more fragile, tariffs increase, and energy prices skyrocket, the effects are felt in the prices of all kinds of goods, in company accounts, and therefore also in wages and family finances. In fact, for decades, China has been able to rely on a huge population, a large number of workers, and an urbanization process that moved millions of people from the countryside to the cities. And this fueled factories, construction sites, and consumption, allowing the country to grow also thanks to an abundant workforce. However, those times are over. And according to official Chinese data, at the end of 2025, the Chinese population was about 1,405,000,000 people. That's about 3.39 million down. In 2025, 7.92 million children were born, while 11.31 million people died. With a birth rate of 5.63 per thousand and a death rate of 8.04 per thousand, and the population has decreased for the fourth consecutive year. And births have dropped by 17% compared to the 9.54 million in 2024. Then, according to official data, in 2025, the number of people over 60 years old in China was about 323.38 million, equal to 23% of the population. Meanwhile, those over 65 were 223.65 million, equal to 15.9%, and by 2035 people over 60 could reach 400 million. A number similar to the population of the United States and Italy combined. And what is the problem? The problem is that an aging population changes the outlook of a country, because it means fewer workers compared to retirees, more healthcare spending, and more pressure on pensions, and it also means weaker consumer spending. Because an aging society tends to be less active and also to invest less. And this is particularly important in China, because China already has a problem with domestic demand. The fact is that under these conditions, to keep growing, it's necessary to increase workers' productivity, and therefore invest in innovation, something that Beijing knows very well. And in fact, it is investing in automation, artificial intelligence, and advanced industry. Just think that according to the World Bank, between 2022 and 2024, Chinese investments in green technologies grew by 23% per year. And they contributed to more than a third of the growth in total investments. So Beijing is trying to replace the old engine with more advanced sectors. However, the transition is not automatic. Because an automated factory can produce a lot, but that doesn't mean it will find a market for its products, especially with a population that already spends little, and as if that weren't enough, is also decreasing. To make matters worse, there's also conflict with Europe and the United States. For years, both have viewed Beijing as a valuable trade partner. China used to produce at low cost and offered a huge market to Western companies, but today the relationship has changed. Because now China is the rival trying to dominate the industrial sectors of the future, and the United States therefore sees China as its main strategic rival. The clash involves tariffs, chips, and AI, with Washington aiming to block Beijing from advanced technologies. Because semiconductors are not only used to produce smartphones and computers, but also data centers, modern cars, and military systems. Europe, on the other hand, has a different problem. Because it needs China as both a market and a supplier, but at the same time it fears being overwhelmed by the invasion of Chinese products in its own markets, and the most concrete case is that of electric cars. For a European consumer, in fact, a cheaper Chinese electric car might even seem like good news, because it lowers prices and increases competition. But for the European industry, it's a problem. The automobile industry is a key part of the continent's economy, which is why the European Commission is reportedly planning tariffs on Chinese hybrid cars. But the European Union had already imposed tariffs on electric cars produced in China starting from 2024. However, China also produces over 90% of the world's processed rare earths and rare earth magnets. These materials are used in products ranging from electric cars to airplanes. And in 2025, Beijing expanded export restrictions by adding 5 new elements, increasing controls on semiconductors, and planning more restrictions for users in the defense sector. This means that China has enormous industrial leverage to influence the decisions of Brussels and Washington. And the European paradox is that Europe wants the energy transition, but to achieve it, it risks needing supply chains dominated by China: batteries, solar panels, rare earths. For all these reasons, China scares the West. And at this point, however, we also have to look at geopolitics, because China, in addition to growing, also wants to shift the global balance of power. And let's start with Russia, because after the invasion of Ukraine, Moscow has become much more dependent on Beijing. China buys Russian energy, offers a commercial outlet, and helps Russia avoid being isolated from the West. Just think that in 2025, Russian gas exports to China through the power of Siberia have risen to 38.8 billion cubic meters, and the two countries have agreed to increase the volumes to 44 billion cubic meters per year. Meanwhile, when it comes to oil, China imported 2.01 million barrels per day from Russia in 2025. That's equal to 20% of China's oil imports. And then there's Taiwan, which for Beijing is a matter of sovereignty, but for the rest of the world mainly means semiconductors, trade routes, and American credibility. China's military growth should be considered alongside its economy, as it seeks more room to maneuver around Taiwan, in the South China Sea, and in its confrontation with the United States. In fact, in 2026, China's national defense spending is set at 1.94 trillion yuan, which is about $282 billion, an increase of 6.9% compared to the previous year. China challenges the West differently in the global South, especially in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, by acting not just as a US rival, but as a financier and alternative partner. For example, the New Silk Road, a network of roads, ports, and railways connecting China globally, serves as a system of influence over participating countries. And just think, in 2025, Chinese involvement in these countries has reached $128.4 billion in construction contracts and $85.2 billion in investments, for a total of $213.5 billion in about 350 agreements, while in 2013 the accumulated Chinese involvement in the New Silk Road is close to $1,400 billion. These numbers explain why Beijing has such a strong influence in the global South. In 2025, Africa was the leading area for Chinese involvement, reaching $61.2 billion with an increase of 283% compared to the previous year. Meanwhile, Chinese involvement in energy reached $93.9 billion, the highest level since the launch of the New Silk Road. And all of this logically scares Europe and the United States. And what do you think? Will China manage to establish itself as the new superpower? Let me know in the comments.